Finally, we've arrived at pivot tables. Pivot tables are arguably one of the most useful data analysis capabilities within Excel, and the learning curve to produce these is not that steep. So what does a pivot table do? It uses an efficient process to aggregate data. You specify some columns of your data set. The primary output will be basic summary statistics, and I'm guessing you're going to be familiar with these. Counts, sums, averages, endpoints of a distribution. Put differently, a pivot table is basically a quick way to do the kind of analysis you would use conditional functions for. Lastly, you might be wondering why it's called a pivot table. This relates to the flexibility in specifying different dimensions for how you want to aggregate your data. You'll see this in the examples that follow. This data set probably looks familiar to you, and that's because this is the one we used for practicing conditional functions. To demonstrate the similarity between them and pivot tables, we'll re-answer the questions from before. To create a pivot table, you need to start by making sure your active cell is somewhere within the data set. You could select the entire thing yourself, that's not necessary. You just want to start by having your cell somewhere in here. We go up to the ribbon and move from the Home tab to Insert, and our first option is Pivot Table. After we click that button, the entire data set is selected. And the last thing we specify is where do we want to put this pivot table? We could create a brand new worksheet, but we have plenty of space here. In this case, I'm just going to hit Existing Worksheet and pick a spot to work in. And I'll hit OK. The area in this rectangle is where the pivot table report will be output. And then to construct it, we work in this new Pivot Tables Fields area. As you can see, all the columns from the dataset are displayed. The process going forward is basically clicking and dragging fields from above to these 4 boxes down below. I always like to start by adding fields to the Values box in the bottom right corner. These are going to be the fields we want to summarize, the ultimate answer to the question you're asking. Usually, these will be quantitative fields with numeric data types, but they don't have to be. In fact, let's start by dragging the name field to the values box. The only summary statistic displayed for text fields is the count, so this is the default output. And we can see that there are 45 instances of name in this dataset. To get rid of a field from any box here, you click it, and a variety of options appear. I'll select Remove Field. Let's try days in office now. It is a numeric field, and the default output for this will be the sum, which we know means to add up all of the values for this field. It looks like presidents have been in office for roughly 86,000 days. Does that sound right? Is this data set correct? Well, a quick calculation off to the side, referencing the sum of days in office divided by 365, 235, yeah, we say our country's been around for roughly 240 years, so this passes a reasonableness check. But wait, where did my pivot table go? To go back to those options, you need to click somewhere in the report itself. So what if I want to do something different besides summing this field? Again, let's click on it in the Values pane, but this time we're going to select the very last option, Value Field Settings. At the top, we could retitle what we're going to call the output. I'm just going to leave it as is. But down below, we can select different ways of summarizing that field. Let's start answering the questions from before by looking at the minimum and maximum values. I select min, hit OK, and there we have William Henry Harrison's very short time as president. You can summarize multiple fields in the values box. I'll drag down another instance of days in office. But again, instead of wanting sum, I click it, value field settings, and this time we'll hit max. And honestly, if I wanted these figures, I probably would have just opted for the formula approach. But let's move on to the next question to really see where pivot tables can be handy. We're going to count the number of presidents from each political party. I'm going to get rid of these values. And this time, I think I'll bring back the name field. We know the default option there is to count things up, but we want to separate this count for each unique political party. Before, I gave those to you. I specifically listed out Republican, Democrat, Federalist, and so forth. In other words, to do a comprehensive conditional function, you would need to know all the distinct values that the party field could take on. We don't need to worry about this with pivot tables. It will handle that for us. I'm going to drag now party field down to the rows column. You can use rows and columns to indicate the dimensions across which you want to explore the field in the values box. I generally like to start with rows because I prefer to scan a single column of data going top down as opposed to a single row going from left to right. And here we've got our answer to the second question that quickly. And not only that, we have a value for a party that I didn't provide you in the last table. We have a none here. This one relates to George Washington, who was expressly against the idea of political parties, but he wasn't included in our last analysis. So that's one nice thing about pivot tables is it will snag all the unique values for you. Let's try the next one. Average days in office for Democrats versus Republicans. Let's remove names and drag down days in office. We're starting with sum. How do we change this to average? Again, we click sum of days in office, value field settings, and then we choose our summary method, average. And this is pretty good. We can get our answer now by comparing Democrats to Republicans across the rows. But what if we had more than just a few parties to be looking at? What if we only want to display Democrat and Republican only? Since the party field is already a dimension in our pivot table, we can click this drop down next to row labels and specify only the parties we want to be displayed. That was pretty easy. The last question involved two criteria. We not only cared about the political parties, but we also cared about the inauguration year. Inauguration year is not currently a dimension in our pivot table, and we don't want it to be. We don't want to summarize these amounts for each unique instance of inauguration year, but we could try putting it in the filters box. And this is where pivot tables start to get clunky. When we look through the different filtering options, you would have to go through and uncheck every single box you don't want to see for this to work. Normal data filters in Excel can work smarter than this, but the process hasn't yet been updated for pivot tables. But there's always more than one solution to a problem in this class. Let me show you one way of getting around this. I'm going to add a new field to our original data set. I'll call it after 1900. And to practice our logical functions, I'm going to set up a logical test where if the value for inauguration year is greater than 1900, the value for true, say yes, otherwise no. Double click the fill handle to copy that down, and this is a quick way to separate the data. But you'll notice, going back to the pivot table, it has not been included as a new field. We have to give Excel explicit instructions to extend the data range. You'll notice up at the top in the ribbon, we have two new tabs. The latter one deals with design elements. We could make our pivot table green to show some school spirit. But the first one says Pivot Table Analyze. Let's click that one. And within this data area, the second option says Change Data Source. I'll click that. And now we can extend the data range to cover the entire data set. We hit OK, and now after 1900 appears as a field in this table. Now I can bring it to the filters box, select only the yeses, and we're almost there. I forgot, we don't want the average days in office, we wanted the total, so I must change the value field setting from average to sum. And there's the answer that we had before. Let's practice this one more time, but with the IMDb Movies dataset. I would encourage you to try these 3 questions on your own, pausing the video now, and then continuing to watch my solutions only after you've given it your best shot. Question 1, in minutes, what is the length of the shortest and longest run time for movies on this list? Well, I'll drag down runtime twice into the values box, but I'll change sum to both min and max. Question 2, calculate the average rating of these movies by genre. So you have to think to yourself, what is the field I'm trying to aggregate and which one is the dimension? Well, average rating. Rating seems to be the field I want to put in the values box. So I'll remove these and add rating. But I don't want to take the sum of this. I mean, what does this even mean? We've got roughly 8,000 points of rating out there. I mean, that's nonsensical. We need to be sure we're taking the average of this. So 7.94, that is the unconditional average of all the films on this list, but we want this broken down by genre. And as you can see, there are plenty of different genres that I didn't display earlier. We just focused on several. But once again, interestingly, Western tops the list with the highest average rating. Question 3, calculate the average box office revenues of these movies by certificate. Well, I'll remove these fields. It's basically the same process as before. I'll bring down box office revenues, change the aggregation method to average, and bring down certificate to my rows. Now these all look like very similar numbers. Some have 3 decimal places, some just have 1. To facilitate comparison, I'll select all of these, and up here in our number formatting options, I'll hit this $sign. Oh, and it makes it much more apparent that again, PG-13 has the highest average revenues. PG only had 9 million. We don't want to mix these up just because of the way we've aligned our numbers. So I hope this has been a pretty manageable introduction to pivot tables. Now, since we've finished this week's lecture video, it's time to submit your completed file in order to get credit for having participated today. Now, this is an important thing to note. For full credit, you don't have to have everything perfect. I just want to see a good faith effort. Some evidence that you've actually been following along. So please don't spend time worrying about if every single formula is exactly expressed the same way I did it. Heck, I don't even need you to have all the answers right. I will be scanning these files, and if your Excel file is just full of empty cells only, that is going to be a problem. I'll probably reach out to you for an explanation there. But as long as you are actively following the steps covered across all these videos, you're going to be absolutely fine. And as always, if you have any questions about this or any other element of the course, don't hesitate to reach out.